Again, welcome to everyone to this third session of Politics and Pope Francis. We're excited to have you back with us. And for those who are watching the recording, we're excited to have you be a part of that as well. We're going to start with the prayer. Seems only appropriate that we're using the prayer from Fratelli Tutti. We use the prayer to the Creator. Just kind of settle ourselves in this time. Lord, Father and Mother of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen.
Amen.
Without further ado, we were glad to again welcome back our good friend Ed Dverdick. And Ed, take it away.
Thank you, Russ, once again. And thanks to all who are joining us today. Once again, if this is your first time joining us live, a very special welcome to you. I hope you had a chance to view at least some of the previous two sessions up in recordings. But today is the third of the three, the final one. I hope to leave us today with a sense of hope, the same sense of hope that Pope Francis instills in us, and give us some practical ideas of what we can do, where we can go with the sorts of things we've been talking about. So let's begin. Session 3. Now, if I don't think this is true of anybody here with us, but if someone had never really heard or knew much at all about Pope Francis prior to these webinars that we've been having here every 2 weeks, this might be the picture you have of Pope Francis, a very dour, scowling social critic tucked away in an ivory tower somewhere, building a reputation on being cynical and skeptical and just down on society as is. Is that an accurate picture? Not really. We know that. The encyclicals, yes. The 3 of them amount to a fairly incisive critique of the status quo. And that's a point I've been trying to bring home throughout these webinars, that for whatever else they are, they constitute at least the basis of a very, very insightful and incisive critique of society, of social, political, and economic critique of our world, our status quo. His focus, though, as we know, is on positive ideals for cultural and spiritual transformation. This is what most of the colloquia are about. Most of the parish missions on Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti you might have attended or held yourself have been dealing with that positive message, the positive principles to come out, the things we aspire to. Care for creation, most prominently, of course, in Laudato Si, and fraternity and friendship among the prominent principles of Fratelli Tutti. The thing is, and again, I've been emphasizing this, these are ground up matters of personal spiritual commitment. These are the kind of humane, visceral, fiber level things that we do as people of this world. And if you're Catholic and or Christian, it's part of our fabric, part of our social being to keep these things at the forefront of our being. Care for creation, fraternity, and friendship. This is the aspiration of Pope Francis. The problem is, as we've been discussing, and as I've been pounding home, neoliberalism is entrenched at a structural, systemic level in our society. Does Francis give us no particular blueprints for addressing it, not just at the personal spiritual level, but at the social, political, and economic level? Acknowledging that he is a critic of the status quo in our, at least Western developed world, is he offering us no particular blueprint of how to change the systemic and the structural above us? Well, I think the answer is obvious. Of course not. That's not his job. He's Pope. He's the pontiff. He's not a politician. He's not a political strategist. He's not a political revolutionary. He's not about political, social, economic transformation. His job is to do what he is doing, guiding us spiritually as the flock, the faithful of the world. And he's doing, I think, arguably a magnificent job of doing it. Still, I think it could be argued, and I will suggest here today, it could be argued that Francis is indeed urging us towards social, political, and economic change, even though he's not laying out blueprints of his own. And I think Pope Francis would acknowledge that there's no shortage of alternatives out there, models and visions that have already been pursued and developed and written about and even tried by other people. So that's what I want to look at today. Going to that first point, Francis's own initiatives. Last year, he was hoping to convene a conference of young people, an economic conference. He thought the title should be The Economy of Francesco, Young People, a Commitment to the Future. And it indeed was targeted toward, as he said, young economists and entrepreneurs, people who are actively thinking about the economic workings of our society and who are interested in changing it. Lo and behold, could it be a modern counterpart to the things we talked about in the first section? Remember, neoliberalism really had defining moments. The Walter Lippmann Colloquium in 1938, the meeting of the Mount Pelerin Society in 1947, gatherings of economic type people, economists, business people, to steer capitalism and the modern economic world in a particular direction that, as we saw, tends to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Is Francis thinking along those lines? It's time to put our heads together and start to map out a new economy, a new way of going about economics. Well, as fate would have it, you can see the dates there. It was nearly a year ago to the day. This week, last year, the US was already starting its principal lockdown. People were not going out, and we were starting a long process, proved to be a long process of quarantining and being very careful. Italy, of course, had been under those sorts of protocols for a number of weeks by that point. So the conference itself didn't happen a year ago this week. Note also, though, the location of this. Assisi. Pope Francis said, we're going to do this in Assisi, which leads us to ask the question, which Francesco is Francis referring to here? Is it Francesco the Pope, or is it our friend St. Francis of Assisi? Could be either, could be a little bit of both. Maybe he meant it to be intentionally kind of ambiguous. It would come as no surprise to Franciscans. Those of us who are Franciscans or in the Franciscan family, one capacity or another, know that Francis and the brothers have been there at every step of the way since the beginning of the modern economy, trying to offer a more humane alternative to the excesses of capitalism. I won't go into it here, but Franciscans are notable for developing what were the earliest forms of pawn shops. They were a charitable sort of institution early on, Montes Pietatis, a means of addressing some of the people left behind by the growth of capitalism in Renaissance Europe. It wouldn't be surprising to us if Pope Francis did have Francis of Assisi in mind. There's ample writing on the fraternal economy among my brothers, among the Capuchins and OFM, thinking about what a fraternal economy to replace the system we have now would have to look like. So let's pray, let's hope that that Franciscan presence will continue in the mind of Pope Francis and his initiatives for a new economy. As many things so happened last year, it was the conference itself, the live conference was canceled, moved back to November to be a virtual meeting, and it did take place in November of last year, and it still achieved its aim. Francis wanted to gather more than 2,000 people, particularly young people under the age of 35. They met virtually in November. And one of the ongoing, lasting, enduring elements of the initiative is they established at that point 12, what they call 12 economy of France's villages. Think of these more as working groups, ongoing collections of people now electronically around the world working on particular issues and aspects of what a Franciscan, an economy of Francis might look like. And you see words popping up in these that you wouldn't see in other sorts of economic conferences: happiness, peace, care, vocation. These are the sorts of things we don't normally associate with economic conferences. Certainly not something like the colloquium of Walter Lippmann. And we can probably note that notably absent from those economy of Francis working groups, villages, was a what's in it for me village. There wasn't really a strong sense of the status quo at this conference, this virtual meeting, or coming out of it. So I think it's safe to say that Francis sees us as putting this sort of world behind, where men, wealthy men in suits, decide what our fate is going to be. The second thing I mentioned is the alternative visions. It's realistic, I think, to believe that Francis already is aware that there are many alternative visions quite consistent with the vision he has. No doubt acknowledges that he didn't invent this thing called political economic criticism. It's been around for quite a while, and certainly modern capitalism has invited its own versions of it. Most notably for us, in that name of Karl Marx, one of the earliest and best critics of the capitalist system, now undergoing various transformations that even Marx couldn't have anticipated. Francis recognizes it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel here to displace neoliberalism and all the excesses of neoliberalism that we talked about. There are other things at our disposal, but there's a caution here, and he notes it. To replace one ism with another ism isn't always a good idea. Isms tend to lock us into particular worldviews. They prevent us from generating dialogue and trying to understand alternative approaches that are brought forth by people with common interests, but who just have a different tradition behind them. A quote from Francis from Fratelli Tutti. Nowadays, it has become impossible for someone to express a view on any subject without being categorized in one way or the other, either to be unfairly discredited or to be praised to the skies. Isms can be difficult for us. Isms can lock us into particular worldviews that don't allow us to see how others are approaching the problem. That said, the three that I want to consider today, as consistent with Pope Francis's vision, yet having their own unique and storied traditions, they are isms. They have been captured by something ism, for better or for worse. But I do think that each of these contributes to the vision that Pope Francis has in mind for us. The first of these is communitarianism. And if we're going to juxtapose or contrast these with particular aspects of neoliberalism that we've talked about, I think it's best to contrast communitarianism with individualism, and most notably the hyper-individualism that we talked about last week of neoliberalism. Communitarianism is basically about balance. Communitarianism attempts to balance the responsibilities we have to the community, the common good, as we sometimes call it, with individual freedom. It's not opposed to individual freedom. It just says, in contrast to classical liberalism and certainly to neoliberalism, that individual freedoms need to be weighed against and balanced against our commitments and responsibilities to the community. And in doing this, communitarians have advocated this thing that we call positive rights, as opposed to negative liberties. This bears a little bit of explanation, comes from political philosophy. Liberties, as they're understood in the liberal tradition, especially the libertarian tradition, tend to be negative things. Take, for example, property rights. We say we have rights to property in the United States, for example. That doesn't mean that we all have a right to a television or a car or even a house. We don't have rights, positive rights to particular things. To say we have a right to property is a negative thing. It says if we have property, you and all other people are not allowed to take it away. So Russ is right to his lawnmower as his promise. Assuming you have a lawnmower, Russ, maybe not. Your right to your lawnmower is essentially a restriction upon me and everybody else. It's your lawnmower. We can't take it away from you. It's a negative sort of liberty. What communitarians want to talk about are positive freedoms. For example, maybe the most prototypical example, healthcare. To say that we have a right to healthcare, and many people say this, certainly communitarians and many others, to say we have a right to healthcare isn't just putting a restriction on what other people can do. It's not a negative thing limiting them. It is a positive demand upon them, because for me to be guaranteed healthcare, it's going to require a contribution from you and everybody else. It's a positive liberty in the sense that I can lay claim to it, and it means it's going to be a demand, a positive demand on other people, not just a negative restriction on what they can't do, as with the case of property. So communitarianism advocates positive rights in this attempt to balance responsibilities and liberties. Communitarianism, to its credit, has a wonderful, rich academic tradition. Philosophically, we can say it goes back to Rousseau, Montesquieu in the 18th century, but certainly even in the most recent decades, where it's actually been named communitarianism. We want to credit people like Amitai Etzioni, German-Israeli sociologist who pretty much coined the modern use of the term in the 1990s. He's been doing work in this area. This is one of his more famous works. But it also has a contemporary philosophical aspect to it. Most notably among a couple of Catholics. On the left, we see Charles Taylor. On the right, we see Alistair MacIntyre, both renowned, both living Catholic philosophers who have been aligned and really identify themselves with this communitarian tradition. Aside from, and maybe beyond these academic writings about communitarianism and the complexities of what positive rights are, communitarianism was popularized by a few books in the last 4 decades. First one, 1985, Robert Belv's Habits of the Heart. Some of you might have read this. It was a very big selling and widely popular book. It's an academic book in the sense that Bella and his colleagues, who are the authors of it, are sociologists and based on their empirical research. But it's an immensely accessible book that talks about the erosion of American society because of individualism and promotes a communitarian alternative. And then about 15 years later, Robert Putnam, actually a much bigger selling book, Bowling Alone, was a top seller for quite a while. Putnam can be said to be in this communitarian tradition, lamenting the increase of individualism in American culture and the resulting decline in the sense of community. Bowling alone being this kind of iconic image that he dwelt on. People go to bowl alone. Who knew? The unfortunate thing with communitarianism is it doesn't have much of a literal political history. There's never been a communitarian party in the US or I don't think anywhere else in the world. Certainly not a party that's aligned itself with these particular principles, much less this name. And maybe part of the problem is it may be a little bit too diffuse to try to pin to a political party. The rhetoric of the common good we have already seen to be appropriated across the political spectrum. It has been in the US. In his 2008 and 2012 campaign speeches, Barack Obama gave some of the most beautiful, eloquent statements of the communitarian ethic, caring for the least of these among us, just the sort of thing that Pope Francis is talking about. Unfortunately, Barack Obama's presidency may have veered more toward the neoliberal tradition, but certainly he is aware of what the communitarian tradition holds and expressed it in his electoral campaigns. Yet at the same time, someone as far to the right as Rick Santorum, conservative Republican, both in social issues and economic issues, claims that mantle, communitarian. So with a diversity like that, it's hard to say just where this might fit in politically in the US. That said, I don't know much about it. I just came across it recently. There is an Institute for Communitarian Studies, Policy Studies, presumably looking at the practical application of communitarian ethical principles in society. And they're right here in George Washington University in the US, the DC area. So somebody is looking at communitarianism at a very practical policy-based level. So look them up if you're at all interested. The second of the three traditions I wanted to focus on is democratic socialism. And if we're opposing each of these to a particular aspect of neoliberalism, democratic socialism, I think, is most vehemently opposed to not simply the market, but the ideology, the religion of the market, the idea that the market, the free market, will save us from all of our ills and solve all of our problems for us. The good thing about democratic socialism, the positive thing, is that it is there in politics. It's a strong and growing political movement, thanks in large part over the last few years to Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Both identify themselves as democratic socialists, both organize under that mantle, and have brought a number of people into the democratic socialist movement. That background photo that we saw before it faded there was the Democratic Socialists of America rally in New York City. March, it appears to be. The DSA was founded by Michael Harrington in the 1960s and still thrives. In fact, they've seen enormous growth in the last few years and are now very active among many state and county level Democratic political parties in the US. So unlike communitarianism, democratic socialism has a political footing in this country. Now, conservatives, the GOP, like to portray contemporary democratic socialism as an attempt to simply sanitize Marxist socialism. And if you listen to the rhetoric, we're trying to make America Venezuela and set up gulags and things like that. That, of course, is all political rhetoric. And it ignores the fact that that's not at all the case. Socialism is far older than Karl Marx. Different forms of socialism predate Marxism. Most notably, utopian socialism has been around since the early 19th century. Karl Marx was writing his dissertation on metaphysical materialism in ancient Greek philosophy, not even thinking about matters of economics, when folks like Robert Owen and others were writing and actually building experimental societies. This is probably the nameplate of utopian socialism. They actually attempted to build communities based on these principles in the hopes that it would be, the world would change by virtue of a network of similarly minded utopian socialist communities. One of them, not far from us here in Chicago, those of us who are looking in Chicago, in southern Indiana, New Harmony was established in the early 19th century, lasted several years. Like all utopian socialist communities, experimental communities, they eventually folded. Maybe that's part of the question as to how much has to change at the systemic level. We won't go into that, but still it represents an early and enduring theory and approach to socialism that is apart from Marxism entirely. In fact, Marx was very critical of these utopian socialist communities. He didn't think they had what it takes to change society. Again, a discussion for a different occasion. Parallel to utopian socialism, and really almost part and parcel, it was hard to separate these two in the 19th century, was Christian socialism. By name, there were many people who defined their own political ideals as Christian socialists. They were Christians who believed that a socialist economy was the best way to bring about the kingdom of God in this world, to prepare for the kingdom of God. Most notable names among those are Frederick Denison Maurice, mid to late 19th century, he was operating, and Francis Bellamy. Francis Bellamy's cousin, Edward Bellamy, is the author of a very famous utopian socialist novel, Looking Backwards. And as some of you might know, Francis Bellamy went on to write the American Pledge of Allegiance. A Christian socialist wrote our Pledge of Allegiance. What do you know about that? And arguably, democratic socialism has been there in the Catholic tradition for quite a while. Catholic worker houses, Dorothy Day, a former member of the Communist Party before she became a kind of return to the Catholic Church. Peter Morin, himself a critic of communism at his time for obvious reasons. But I would say it's fair to characterize Catholic worker houses and the Catholic worker movement as, in name at least, a kind of democratic socialist sort of movement. And of course, liberation theologies, based communities fit very well into this democratic socialist model or aspiration for society. And it's something well worth noting on today, the 41st anniversary of the assassination of Oscar Romero. May he rest in peace. The third of the three isms, for better or worse, that I wanted to bring to our attention and point out is, I think, consistent with what Pope Francis is aspiring to, is populism. And again, to put it in contrast with a particular aspect of neoliberalism, we'll say this contrasts most strikingly with plutocracy, the rule of the few, and more precisely, the rule of the few with wealth, the rule of wealth in the hands of a few people, which many people would argue, I think myself among them, we have in the United States right now, despite the appearances of a democratic society, we are arguably in the throes of a plutocracy. Note, this is one of the few of these isms that Francis actually points to. He uses the term, and how he uses it is instructive, I think. So I want to take a look, pretty close look at a passage from Fratelli Tutti that kind of unravels or unweaves the way he's thinking about it. Populism, he says, disregards the legitimate meaning of the word people. Any effort to remove this concept of people from common parlance would lead to the elimination of the very notion of democracy as government by the people. If we wish to maintain that society is more than a mere aggregate of individuals, the term people proves necessary. Men and women are capable of coming up with shared goals that transcend their differences and can thus engage in a common endeavor. Then, too, it is extremely difficult to carry out a long-term project unless it becomes a collective aspiration. All these factors lie behind our use of the word people and popular. Unless they are taken into account, together with a sound critique of demagoguery, a fundamental aspect of reality would be overlooked. We need to acknowledge people, Pope Francis says, but at the very top of this passage here, he says, populism, as the term is used, disregards the legitimate meaning of the word the people. He goes on to really emphasize what he understands by the people. Democratic politics, the notion of democracy is government by the people. People coming up with shared goals that transcend their differences and can thus engage in common endeavor. Collective aspirations. Pope Francis isn't against popular, against people. He's opposed to this term populism. And he kind of plays his hand in the last part. This is pretty much why populism is a pejorative term exclusively in Francis's lexicon. He's concerned about demagoguery because in the European context, populism is used exclusively, pretty much exclusively, to describe right-wing, demagogic, extremist sorts of politics. He's justifiably concerned how populism is used in the European theater, not so much how it's used in the US. You see a picture of Marine Le Pen, daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, longtime leader of the nationalist front, the extreme right in France. Pope Francis, got to imagine, this is what he sees when he hears that word populism. It's why he's worried. Worries about authoritarianism, demagoguery, xenophobia, anti-immigration policies, potential for mob violence. We've seen mob violence in Europe, far-right politics in general. And as we know, this has spread globally in recent years. Simply across the English Channel of late, Boris Johnson represents arguably this sort of politics, the whole Brexit movement, a right-wing, conservative, populist sort of movement. Lord knows those of us in the US can identify Donald Trump as in this vein, a right-wing populist. And now for several years in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, very much in the mold of Donald Trump. Conservative right-wing populism that brings about authoritarian demagogic violence, as we've seen in the US. This ignores, and Pope Francis I don't think ignores, he just doesn't acknowledge and probably doesn't invest his time studying American politics the way Americans might do it, but it ignores a very rich progressive history of the term populism and the populist movement here in the US. It actually was a political party formed in 1891 in Kansas, the People's Party. They ran presidential candidates in the next several elections, never won, of course, but formed a political organization. The members call themselves populists. So in the American lexicon, people who support these progressive ideals use populism in a very, very different way. The populists in the United States in the early 20th century were agrarian, they were progressive. They had what we would now call a left people's agenda, anti-plutocratic agenda. They saw a little bit of a resurgence during the New Deal coalition for obvious reasons. The New Deal coalition was trying to serve the people at the expense of the wealth that was concentrated in a few hands and doing great damage to the country. The thing is, the response by the plutocrats and the elites in the United States, the holders of wealth, those who arguably control much of the political agenda, has been, watch out for those populists. They are dangerous. They are advocates of mob rule. It's been easy for elites in the US to portray populism as it happens in the US in the same way Europe has understood it to be a potentially violent, mob-driven sort of thing. Is that true of the United States? Is that characterization accurate of the populist party and the populist tradition in the United States? Thomas Frank, one of the more recent and articulate authors on this question, says definitely no. He studied the populist movement. He wrote this book, just published within the last couple of years, 2018 or 2019, I believe. Again, highly recommended. The People? No. A Brief History of Anti-Populism in the US. A quote from that book. When we use the word, and he means Americans, populist, to describe demagogues and would-be dictators, we're inverting that historic meaning. Populism was profoundly, achingly democratic. The Kansans who invented the term were referring to something that, by the standards of the time, were anti-demagogic, that were pro-enlightenment and pro-equality. In its heyday and alone among American political parties of the time, populism stood strong for human rights. Populism had prominent women leaders. Populism despised tyrants and imperialism. Populism defied the poisonous Southern white solidarity. Very, very different tradition. And I lament the fact that we didn't have the opportunity to test the differences between these two in 2016. This is the presidential race that could have been. If it were Trump against Bernie Sanders, we might have seen in the United States context what the real differences are between this demagogic right-wing populism and the populist populism, the anti-plutocrat, progressive populism of someone like Bernie Sanders. Note these differences, despite the fact that a lot of pundits try to portray the two of them as similar in their populist agendas. For Trump, something like the media bugged him and him alone. The mainstream media peddle lies and fake news to discredit me. We've heard this in the US over the last 4 years. It's all about their attack on Donald Trump. For Bernie Sanders, during his campaigns, corporate media respond to the interests of their sponsors, not us. It's not about him in particular. It's about how we are shortchanged by corporate media. We don't get the full information because media are serving their sponsors and not we, the consumers. There's this famous scene during the 2019 presidential campaigns, being interviewed on CNN, talking about healthcare prices and pharmaceutical prices. And Bernie says to the host, I'm not sure who it was, but how can we have an honest conversation about healthcare costs in this country if within 3 minutes you're going to be cut into a commercial from Pfizer? And within 3 minutes, they were cut into a commercial from Pfizer, just to maybe prove Bernie Sanders' point. For Trump and right-wing populism, scientists and intellectuals are the enemy. They're not to be trusted. Climate change, COVID-19, they're all overblown. That's not what populism is about. That's not what progressive populism would suggest. Sanders, among others, has suggested science, medicine, pharmacology, these are all important to us. They're invaluable. They should have public support, but they should serve people, not profits. Not to the extent that pharmaceutical companies are profiting now. Trump, trust me and only me. Demagoguery, pure and simple. Sanders' campaign slogan, not me, us, progressive populism. Now, all of this said, we have to wonder, Is the distance between progressive populism as represented by people like Sanders, AOC, is it as much of a distance between that and the neoliberalism, which we've been talking about throughout much of this series? There are differences between someone like Sanders and even his very close friend, and even someone considered a strong for the people Democrat like Joe Biden. For Biden, for President Biden, his electoral strategy last year eventually became the traditional centrist Democratic one. You line up a few big money donors and you try to change the minds of swing voters in key districts. In other words, focus on changing the minds of a handful of people and use money to do that. Sanders' electoral strategy all along was many small donors, average $27, widely proclaimed, and expand the electoral base with that, bring more voters into the process. Sanders would lament the fact that voter turnout in presidential elections was in the mid 50% for many years now. He was trying to bring that up. It did come up in this last election, maybe in part due to absentee voting and the pandemic allowing us to vote more readily, but very different ideals there. Joe Biden, President Biden, still represents a deference to military industrial complex, as it's been called by Dwight Eisenhower. The arms industry, that hasn't changed very much, isn't likely to change. Sanders, populism, progressive populism advocates drastic cuts in military spending, using that money for social services. Again, President Biden, still a very high deference to Silicon Valley and the high-tech industry. For progressive populism, make that industry and Zuckerberg pay their damn taxes, as Sanders says. And for Joe Biden, certainly in the last election, maybe we'll see this change. He sees his legitimacy, arguably, as deriving from decorum, going back to normal was kind of his campaign message, going back to what we had before, the appearance of bipartisanship and decorum. For someone like Sanders, that never was a concern. Legitimacy comes from popular mandate, not on how he appears in the public eye, but what his policies, whether his policies have popular support, and he felt that they do. Now, all of this said, and in parting, definitely in parting, all of this said, gotta wonder if all of this is a little bit moot, thanks to our friend, the COVID virus. Is the real challenge to neoliberalism, everything we've been talking about here, not necessarily a particular ism or particular characters like Bernie Sanders or AOC or other progressive politicians? Could it be the fact that we just have to adjust to a new world, one that's going to involve a more benevolent government taking care of us in ways that they hadn't had to do for a long time? Consider the Biden, Schumer, Pelosi $1.9 trillion America Rescue Plan, just signed into law 2 weeks ago by President Biden. It's the US's most ambitious government economic relief program since what? Since FDR's New Deal? Since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s? No, it's the most ambitious government economic relief program since last year. The Trump, McConnell, Pelosi $1.8 trillion CARES Act was, until its time, it was the most progressive and the most comprehensive of a relief plan. Does Donald Trump care to take apart neoliberalism? Is Donald Trump really a man of the people? Doubtfully. We don't really get that impression. His economic hand was forced by conditions, and we might recognize that politics is going to change inevitably over the next few years as a result of both the pandemic and, coming out of it, the climate crisis, which is going to be as severe, if not more severe than before, since our attention has been taken from it. I leave you with a quote, a promising newspaper article fresh off the pages of the news. Just saw this morning on Axios. President Biden recently held an undisclosed East Room session with historians that included discussion of how big is too big and how fast is too fast to jam through once in a lifetime historic changes to America. Biden is thinking about a long-term legacy, not just short-term policies, but he's really thinking I think, for the better about profound changes in how government works in the US. Why this matters, according to Axios, the historians' view were very much in sync with Biden's own. It's time to go even bigger and faster than anyone expected. If that means chucking the filibuster and bipartisanship, so be it. So that characterization I had just a moment ago of Joe Biden being kind of the legacy of neoliberalism of the Democratic Party, there might be some room for hope here. Conditions may pull President Biden along those lines that many people who want a more humane government supporting the lives of all of us and not just the wealthy few. You might be seeing those days. It would mean some more permanent changes. The child tax credit, for example, that was implemented in the Biden package expires in a year. Biden is now considering the possibility of making that permanent, meaning the cut in child poverty in the US is expected to be 50% this year. A substantial cut in childhood poverty wouldn't be just a temporary thing, but a permanent thing. We can only hope and pray, but I think in summary, this is the sort of thing Pope Francis is inviting us to think about. How do we apply these principles of care for creation, of fraternity, and a government, a society of fraternal care? How do we apply this in our politics? Well, the models are there. We just have to look for them. We have to synthesize them. We have to talk with people. And with that, I think I'm going to shut up and allow some time for discussion here. And I'll stop sharing this.
Great. Well, thank you, Ed, for getting always kind of like mind expanding experience of doing that. So today's going to be a little different as far as questions and answers discussion. If you have a question, at the bottom of your screen, there is an icon with like a little smiley face and a plus called reactions. If you press that on there, you can also then raise your hand. So there's an option to raise your hand, and I can unmute you and you can speak live without having to type it. And we'll go from there. As people are thinking about questions, you can also put stuff in the chat box, and we'll continue to look at that and work with that. But if there are, my kind of first question to you, Ed, to kind of start us out, is as you look at the kind of dichotomies you set up of, the vision of Pope Francis and kind of the non-vision of Pope Francis, or the opposite at least, there seems to be a kind of an overall view of the human person in Pope Francis as fundamentally good. Fundamentally will hopefully do the good thing overall. I mean, not saying there's no sin, not saying we don't, aren't under the, the shadow of original sin and all that, but how would you describe that kind of way of how it also kind of influences and where that comes in as a way of kind of starting that? So
we touched on this last time when we were talking about individualism. In many ways, when we conceive of just what individualism is in our society, we imply a certain anthropology. The ideology of the free market, neoclassical economics, going all the way back to classical liberalism, it certainly was neoclassical economics in the 19th and 20th century, says anthropologically, we are Homo economicus, we are built toward maximization of our own self-interest. And that just is the way it is. It's a psychological thing. It's a purely anthropological, this is the nature of the human being. It's not a normative thing that says, go and do this. It says, this is the way we are. You can understand that to be a very negative sort of basis for avarice and greed. Or like someone like Adam Smith, you can say, hey, we're stuck with it, but let's harness it in such a way that it makes us a humane, benevolent, loving society. Adam Smith actually talked more about the moral sentiments that come out of that than the fact that we are simply going to gather all we can for ourselves. He wanted to harness self-interest. I think we in the Catholic tradition have a very different anthropology of the human being. It comes from us being imago Dei. Depending on which theologian you ask, there's certain degrees of being tainted by original sin. Maybe Augustine at one extreme, and I don't know, Karl Rahner at the other. I'm no theologian, but I think the image maybe the key thing here is we as Catholics don't bring into the political arena a vastly different understanding of the individual. It's not that the Imago Dei, the individual as Imago Dei, is just going to be intranslatable to other people, non-believers, people from different faith traditions. I think they're compatible as long as we understand that psychological individualism, as we talked about last time, says, yeah, we kind of accept that we're geared toward looking out for our interests first, and we do what we need to do to ensure that that doesn't overwhelm us and we don't become greedy, avarice. We don't become people that are solely self-interested. We harness that in ways that say, my care for you contributes to my own well-being. And that's what Francis's message is, that fraternal bond is a mutual support. It's not altruism, pure and simple. It's not, I'm going to care for you, even if it kills me. It's our mutual care is what keeps us intact. And that's perfectly compatible with democratic socialism, populism, and all the things we talked about today, I think. There is room for conversation there, even if we have a particular understanding of the individual person in the Catholic tradition.
Tom Fox has a question. So Tom.
Well, I was,
Comment.
thank you very much for your talks. I've been kind of turned on by this Michael Sandel's book on tyranny of merit.
Wonderful.
Have you, are you familiar with that?
I mentioned it, I cited it last time. Yeah, that's going to be on the suggested reading list. It's wonderful.
I'm listening to it. He's reading it himself. But it's sort of like outside of a political theory. It's more of a economic theory, it seems like. But still, I like the way he puts things together, although I can't say that I can put it together systematically rather. But it was, it was quoted in that in the book that they just put out by, never can remember his name, Ivany, the guy that writes on the Vatican. He's wrote this book on Pope Francis. Anyway, I
think it's a wonderful book. It'll be on our suggested reading list that I'm going to give to Russ to send to everybody. I mentioned it last week in the context of individualism. And it's what he writes about is indeed very counterintuitive, because we have come to think of meritocracy as a very benign thing. It rescues us from the throes of aristocracy. It says we don't reward people based just on their heritage, based just on their blood. We reward people based on their merit, their talents, their qualities, the things they have to offer. And Sandel's point is very much, I mentioned when we were talking about this last time, 2 weeks ago, Sandel at that very moment was on a panel at Georgetown University on Fratelli Tutti. He's very much consistent with Francis's message of a more communal understanding of society. His concern about meritocracy is that it rewards the talented, but the talented don't necessarily merit their talents. So to say that the people in power have that power, have that wealth, have their resources by the virtue of the fact they're more talented and have more skills than us, provides a justification for leaving everybody else behind. And that wasn't there in aristocracy. He notes repeatedly that during an aristocracy, most people are willing to say, yeah, I didn't earn this. My dad's the king. I get all these benefits from him. And the rabble could say the same thing. I'm as good a person as the aristocracy. It's just that this system won't allow me to excel. Unfortunately, in a meritocracy, as Sandel describes it, we tend to internalize our status. And people who are left behind in the rise of talents to the top tell themselves, well, I must be worthless. And that's not true. They're not worthless, Francis. Pope Francis is telling us, you're not worthless. You have a great deal of value. You just don't happen to have the talents that are valued by the current market system. So yes, read that book. Excellent. I'll put it on the reading list so everybody has access to a link.
Thank you.
Other questions that people have? Other questions or comments or thoughts from this or even the other previous sessions as a kind of trying to bring it all together.
I must have answered all questions in the course of the presentation.
Well, I was intrigued as you were talking about that Pope Francis didn't really talk about the, if you will, populism, at least is how we've experienced it in the popular populism in the United States. Reflecting back on the speech that Pope Francis gave before Congress, where he basically looked at three kind of figures in American history: Lincoln, Dorothy Day, and Martin Luther King, and kind of that kind of approach of how he brought that into the idea of kind of populism. But Steve Pavignano, you can unmute. I think I've asked you to unmute, and you can go ahead.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate all four of your presentations. I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an economist by any means. But one of the things that's concerned me over the three talks is the number of times when you've had to interpret how Pope Francis is using terms compared to how we in America normally understand them, and how that can very much change how we react or even implement what the Holy Father is trying to get us to do. And for 3 weeks now, I've been trying to figure out how do we give a glossary of this is what the term means when the Holy Father uses it, as opposed to how we Americans understand it. And I don't know how to deal with that yet. Any thoughts?
That's an excellent question, Steve. Really, the very premise, the pretext of this series of webinars was to do just that. And we saw that it took 3 hours, most of which of me blabbing away, trying to clarify what the language means. And that's language once removed from the primary language. I'm working with English translation. So who knows how these terms get understood when the original encyclicals get translated into other languages and non-European languages. This is, not to put too fine a point on, this is the problem of philosophy of language. Some philosophers think that all philosophy comes down to how we use terms, how we find meaning in the terms we use. So in a sense, even though this was about political philosophy, political science, and economics, it was an attempt to kind of alert us to the fact that the language makes a difference. How people respond to these terms depends a lot on what context, what nation, what culture they're coming from. And as I said in the first session, when Francis used that term, neoliberalism, I was nearly blown out of my chair because it's such a loaded term, and how it's understood varies, not only from culture to culture, but from profession to profession. Now, radical left economists point to neoliberalism as a term of opprobrium. Years ago, the Mount Pelerin Society, the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, they thought this was a great term. This was the positive thing to say this is where politics and economics needs to go. And now you won't catch them using that term because it's been turned around. So there's no easy way to do it. If it took us 3 hours just to get to the point of saying, okay, I kind of get an idea of what the complexities are there, you can imagine how difficult it is to sustain this conversation and to keep the focus on how we're using the terms, because how we're using the terms makes all the difference.
I appreciate very much what you've helped us with.
The thing I fear, I keep saying this too, the thing I fear is that we don't confront these questions. And when in Laudato Si, it raised a number of vexing political questions about how we're going to deal with systemic change in the world in order to avert the worst case scenarios of climate change. And my fear has been that we ignore that. We kind of revert back to what we're comfortable with, parish missions and how I'm going to think about creation and pray for creation. That's all great. It's all necessary. But I think Pope Francis is saying, don't stop there. Look at the structure, look at the system, and figure. I'm not going to give you a blueprint, he says, but figure out ways to change that too, because those two have to come to, I don't know what's in camera frame here. Those two have to come, there's my top handers. Those two have to come together. Structural and systemic change we talked about in the spring, last spring in the Laudato Si series. Structural change, personal transformation have to meet. If we rely entirely on what we're comfortable with and familiar with at the level of personal change and transformation, we're going to miss the fact that the structure is still in place. This has to be dismantled up here so it can come down and meet us. Good question, Steve.
I would only respond to that. I think just adding little pieces. I've been reading more and more of Pope Francis's stuff as well, like many of us. It's really almost an invitation into the process of thinking about it. I mean, as you were talking about the economy of Francesco, I mean, as you kind of listen to some of those, the many talks and things they've done on that, but they really are kind of inviting people into kind of like, as you take this kind of approach, what does it lead us to? It's almost that, thinking about it as we think about it in church terms as almost a synodal approach, a synod, like on the Synod on the Amazon, but more of like, it's almost like that process becomes the important piece of it. And that's, I think, difficult for us and sometimes in the West, who are coming from, again, that very scientific, technocratic mindset that there's a very clear answer, or there may be a clear answer, but how that clear answer reveals itself is sometimes through the process. I think that's always the journey piece becomes messy, because even Pope Francis talks about that, even in talking about the Amazon Synod, for instance. He spoke about it as, it didn't leave all the answers, and we kind of left ourselves in the discomfort of not having the answers itself. And I think that becomes kind of how do we do this, particularly as we have to move now from what's this new reality we're trying to create in a post-COVID world. So,
one of the differences, though, I think when Francis envisions putting our heads together on these things, he doesn't envision that room at the colloquium of Walter Lippmann with a bunch of specialists and economists and PhDs. He sees community activists, people who are active, working on these things at the ground level, not necessarily laden with degrees and other academic artillery behind them, but just real people working at the community level to try to solve problems, coming together and building up to systemic change. So Francis, I think, is encouraging that. I think that's what the economy of Francesco is aiming at, bringing together communities to do
Right.
that, not just the experts.
Right.
I think Miguel had his hand up. I thought I saw a hand up.
Did Miguel have his hand up?
I thought I saw a hand raised.
Not seeing it. It's not, does anybody else, if anyone else has a question or a comment, please. So Miguel did put his hand back up. There you go. Miguel, you can unmute yourself and.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm from Portugal in Europe, so it's rather different perspective of all the problems you've been talking. And besides, I'm a researcher at the university, so I'm researching the Catholic politics, or the political implications of the Catholic faith in the organization of popular parties. That's a main interest of mine. So what you said about populists here in Europe, we make a distinction between populist parties and the popular parties. So the popular party is the most voted European party and the most represented party in the European Parliament. So but the populist parties, those from the right wing, far right wing, are almost cannibalizing the Christian values, and well, we used to call it the Christian democracy parties are more or less being left without content in that part of the discourse. So it's very interesting what you're saying, that in America there is also some kind of tension with this matter, but I would like to hear your opinion on how can well, you have said it, the Pope Francis has a view very much from a bottom-up solution to the problems, and that's rather interesting. But how, because Pope Benedict spoke very much to intellectuals, and that's, well, part of my my background. So, and I feel a very high stress of difficulty to bring Pope Francis to an university, a university or college conversations, because he's in some cases it's even considered a bit of a lame discourse. So you've helped me to upgrade his discourse to a university level. So it's very interesting. Thank you very much for that. But I would like to hear a little bit more about your opinion on the matter of these populist movements among and the differences between Europe and American.
Well, thank you, Miguel. It's great to have your perspective as someone coming from Europe here. And you know a lot of this firsthand. I'm not sure about Portuguese politics. Do you have a nationalist party that's been vying for?
Yes, it's a recent acquisition, but we have one.
It has, as you point out, Christian Democrats as conservatives have been prominent in European parliamentary politics for years. They were very strong in Germany for quite a while. But I think the difference is, and what I tried to emphasize today was, in the US, we don't necessarily, despite the efforts of conservative elite politicians for years to discredit the Populist Party and populism, despite their efforts, we don't, in a sort of a knee-jerk automatic way, associate populism with nationalism the way European parties do, or the way people do with European parties. To be a populist in Europe, at least Western Europe, means to be a nationalist. Jean-Marie Le Pen associated France, his movement, with populism. And that entails the other things I mentioned, anti-immigrant policies, very right-wing conservative sort of politics. It wasn't until Donald Trump that we saw that marriage in the US. Evangelical Christianity in the US to this moment still widely support Donald Trump. He has political viability to this day, largely on the basis of his appeal to evangelical Christians. And they associate, in the same way European parties did, they associate him strictly with nationalism. This notion of Jesus is for America and only America, and Jesus is against immigration. And they appropriated that image of God for my nation in the same way European countries have been doing that. European populist nationalist parties have been doing for quite a while. So in a sense, we have finally caught up to Europe. We are finally dealing with a problematic form of populism that was there by reputation and fabrication for decades, because elite politicians would try to discredit the actual populace by saying, oh, it's just mob rule. Now we actually do have a very dangerous situation where, that's why I said to this day, I lament the fact that the 2016 presidential race wasn't Sanders and Trump, just so we can clarify this once and for all. Just so even if Trump were to win, we can at least say, oh, he represents an ugly side of what populism means. He represents harnessing the mob to rule on behalf of the nation. And at least we would have seen, it would have stood out in relief that there was a progressive alternative that says the people know what's going on, and we don't have to rely on experts and elites to run us. If we come together and care for each other, we can build the type of society that Pope Francis is looking for. So I think if you equate populism with nationalism, as it often is done in European politics, we are seeing that now with Trump in the US. And it's something that we have to disengage it. It's recent in our case, so maybe we can disengage the two and really promote a progressive form of populism. But it would mean people taking that mantle and saying, I will stand for the people. And that doesn't mean I approve of mob rule or xenophobia or that I hate immigrants. It's just that the people should rule. Because I think your research sounds fascinating, Miguel. I'd love to hear more about it.
Well, it is past 4 o'clock. Our time has passed. we can continue this conversation as long as people would like to, but we don't want people to feel like they have to stay. I'm going to stop the recording in a few minutes, a few seconds. But before we do that, just want to make sure that we do what we can to thank Ed for being with us these last 3 weeks, three sessions or 6 weeks.
You.
And it's been great to be in this conversation. There'll be more of this type of thing happening to try to figure out how to move this forward. One thing to be looking forward to in the kind of vein of the movement building that Pope Francis is trying to do within, I think, the world and the church is we will be, I think, launching, the Vatican has announced that they will be launching the Laudato Si action platform. It may not sound like a very interesting name of something, but it's a process by which over the next 7 years, the Vatican and the Dicastery of Human Integral Human Development is hoping to help us as a Catholic Church and throughout the world, really, how do we integrate the elements of Laudato Si, that tradition in many ways that has been sharing with us? What does that mean for us to do in practical roll up our sleeves terms at every level and every aspect of being in the Catholic Church and the world? I think it's an exciting kind of prospect for us, a daunting prospect nonetheless, but there seems to be a large amount of resources and efforts that the Vatican is actually putting behind this. So that'll be being kind of announced to a greater degree at the anniversary of Laudato Si in May. So you can look forward to that, amongst many, many other, I think, opportunities for us to kind of come together and figure out how do we take advantage of what some people have called this the Francis moment, or this moment of what I think the Holy Father is inviting us to. But with all that and to look forward to, and thank you for everybody their time. Thank you, Ed, again for being with us. People would like to continue. We'll stay for a while and can have a conversation, and we'll go from there. But thank you again, everybody.